October 24, 1944. The Formosa Strait. The water here is a graveyard of iron and ambition. In the darkness of the Pacific, there was no predator more feared than the USS Tang. She wasn't just a submarine, she was a record breaker, a phantom of the silent service. In just 5 patrols, she had rewritten the manual on underwater warfare, sinking more ships than any other American vessel in the war. Her crew were elite, and her commander, Richard O'Kane, was a legend who preferred to fight on the surface, staring his enemy in the eye. But on this night, the Tang wasn't destined to be killed by a Japanese destroyer or crushed by a depth charge. Instead, the most successful submarine in the U.S. Navy was about to be hunted by herself. It is the ultimate irony of naval history, a single mechanical glitch, a circular run, and a torpedo that would turn 180 degrees in the black water to claim its creator. To understand the tragedy, you have to understand the prestige. By late 1944, the USS Tang was the ace of the Pacific. Under O'Kane, who had already earned a Silver Star as the executive officer of the legendary USS Wahoo, the Tang was relentless. While other subs hid in the depths, O'Kane used the Tang's speed and low profile to wreak havoc on Japanese convoys at night. On her 5th and final patrol, she had decimated 2 large convoys and was down to her final 2 torpedoes. These were the Mark 18 electric torpedoes. Unlike the earlier Mark 14s, which were notorious for running too deep or failing to explode, the Mark 18 was the new tech. It was electric, meaning it left no telltale wake of bubbles. It was a stealth weapon, but it carried a hidden, lethal flaw. If the steering rudders jammed, the gyroscopic guidance system could overcompensate, sending the weapon into a perfect, wide circle back toward the point of origin. At roughly 2 o'clock hours on October 25, the Tang cornered the remains of a Japanese transport convoy. The air was salt-heavy and tense as O'Kane gave the order to fire the final salvo. The first torpedo ran true, striking a transport ship and sending a fireball into the night sky. Then came the final shot, Fire 24. The last Mark 18 leaped from the bow tube. But almost immediately, the lookouts on the bridge noticed a terrifying phosphorescent glow in the water. It wasn't heading away, it was curving hard to the left. O'Kane instantly recognized the circular run and shouted for emergency full speed, attempting to fishtail the massive submarine out of the path of its own weapon. But a submarine does not dance. For 20 agonizing seconds, the men on the bridge watched the wake of their own 600-pound warhead racing toward them. At 2:30, the torpedo struck the Tang near the aft torpedo room. The explosion didn't just damage the sub, it broke her back. The stern disappeared in a geyser of white water, and the Tang began to sink tail first, her bow pointing toward the stars like a tombstone. While most of the crew died in the initial blast or were thrown into the freezing night sea, the story was far from over for those trapped inside. As the hull settled 180 feet down on the ocean floor, the survivors faced a nightmare that no training manual could fully prepare them for. They were at the bottom of the sea, inside a sinking coffin, with only one desperate hope for escape, the Momsen lung. As the Tang plummeted toward the seabed, the internal chaos was absolute. The initial blast had instantly flooded the aftermost compartments, killing everyone in the engine rooms and the aft torpedo room. Within seconds, the submarine struck the ocean floor at a sharp angle, coming to rest at a depth of 180 feet. Inside the forward compartments, the survivors were plunged into a pitch-black, freezing tomb. The sound of groaning steel and the hiss of high-pressure leaks filled the air. These men were elite, trained for the silent service, but no amount of drills can prepare a human being for the realization that they are buried alive under 6 atmospheres of pressure. In the forward torpedo room, about 30 men gathered in the flickering glow of emergency lanterns. They were led by Lieutenant Flanagan, who realized that if they didn't act immediately, the rising pressure or the chlorine gas leaking from the shattered batteries would kill them long before they ran out of oxygen. The escape they were about to attempt remains one of the most harrowing feats in naval history. To get out, they had to use the Momsen lung, a primitive, early rebreather device consisting of a rubber bag, a mouthpiece, and a canister of soda lime to scrub carbon dioxide. For the technical enthusiasts watching, it's important to understand the physics of the 1940s. Escaping from 180 feet is not as simple as opening a door. At that depth, the water pressure is roughly 80 pounds per square inch. To open the escape trunk, the men had to manually equalize the pressure inside the compartment with the pressure of the ocean outside. This meant intentionally flooding the room where they stood. They watched the water rise from their ankles to their knees, then to their chests, as the air trapped at the ceiling became thick, hot, and toxic. As the water reached their necks, the men began the escape in small groups. The process was a test of pure psychological steel. They had to duck under the edge of the escape trunk, enter a small vertical tube, and then float upward into the blackness of the Pacific. But the danger wasn't over once they left the ship. If a man held his breath while ascending from 180 feet, the expanding air in his lungs would literally explode his ribcage, a fatal condition known as an air embolism. They were trained to exhale a constant stream of bubbles, whistling a low tune as they rose to ensure the air escaped their lungs safely. One by one, men ducked into the trunk and disappeared into the dark water. Out of the 30 men who gathered in that room, only 13 managed to leave the sub. By the time the final group was ready, a fire had broken out in the forward battery, filling the remaining air pocket with thick, black smoke and molten rubber fumes. The scene on the surface was no less grim. Of the men who had been on the bridge when the torpedo struck, including Commander O'Kane, only 9 had survived the initial plunge and the hours of treading water in the dark. They floated in a sea of oil and debris, watching the sun rise over the Formosa Strait, only to realize they were not alone. The Japanese frigates they had been hunting earlier were still there, picking through the wreckage of their own sunken ships. The survivors of the Tang, exhausted and suffering from the bends or lung injuries, were pulled from the water not by rescuers, but by their enemies. For the next several months, these men, the elite of the U.S. submarine force, would endure the brutal conditions of Japanese special information camps, their story hidden from the world until the war's end. The irony of the USS Tang is perhaps the most stinging what-if of World War II. If the rudder on that final Mark 18 had been just 1 degree straighter, O'Kane would have returned to Pearl Harbor as the greatest hero of the submarine war. Instead, a masterpiece of American engineering became its own executioner. Today, the Tang still rests 180 feet down in the Formosa Strait, a silent monument to the thin line between a legendary victory and a tragic mistake. It remains the only documented case in history where a submarine was sunk by its own torpedo during combat, a haunting reminder that in the deep, your own shadow is often the most dangerous enemy. The technical aftermath of the Tang's disappearance was initially shrouded in mystery. Because there were no survivors at liberty to report the incident, the U.S. Navy simply listed the Tang as overdue and presumed lost. It wasn't until the war ended and the survivors were liberated from Japanese prison camps that the horrifying truth of the circular run came to light. This revelation sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Ordnance. While the sailors had long complained about the unreliability of American torpedoes, the Tang was the definitive proof that the Mark 18 wasn't just prone to failure, it was potentially suicidal. Post-war investigations revealed that the flaw lay in the steering unit's sensitivity. If the torpedo's gyro was jarred during launch or if the cold-molded rubber seals on the steering vanes stiffened in the chilly Pacific waters, the rudder could lock. Once locked, the torpedo's internal logic would try to correct the course, but because the physical rudder was stuck, the weapon would continue to bank until it completed a 180-degree turn. This technical failure was a deadly mistake born from the rush of wartime production. The Navy eventually implemented anti-circular switches, a fail-safe designed to disarm the warhead if the torpedo turned more than a certain number of degrees, but for the 78 men of the Tang, this engineering correction came much too late. The human cost of this mechanical error was felt most sharply in the Japanese special information camps. Commander Richard O'Kane and his few surviving crewmen were treated not as traditional prisoners of war, but as high-value captives. Because they had been captured while the Tang was on a top-secret patrol, they were subjected to brutal interrogations. They were beaten, starved, and kept in solitary confinement at the infamous Amori and Ofuna camps. The irony was suffocating. The men who had operated the most sophisticated piece of naval technology on the planet were now reduced to eating maggot-infested rice and shivering in unheated cells. O'Kane later remarked that the discipline of the submarine service, the ability to remain calm in a silent, pressurized hull, was the only thing that kept his mind from breaking during those months of captivity. When the survivors were finally brought home in 1945, the story of the Tang became a somber legend. Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor for his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity during the Tang's final engagement. However, the legacy of the ship is defined less by its medals and more by the haunting image of those final seconds. It is a story that resonates with mystery seekers because it challenges our trust in technology. We often view the machines of war as extensions of human will, but the Tang proves they can be fickle, turning on their masters with a mechanical indifference that is more terrifying than any enemy fleet. Today, the USS Tang serves as a grim case study in naval academies, taught to officers as a lesson in both the heroism of escape and the catastrophic consequences of a single point of failure. The wreckage remains a protected war grave, resting in the silt of the Formosa Strait. It is a place of absolute silence, where the ghost that hunted itself finally found its peace. The 78 men who remain within her hull are part of the eternal patrol, a reminder to every submariner who goes below that in the deep, the most dangerous weapon in the water is sometimes the one you just fired. To grasp the full weight of the Tang's final moments, one must look closely at the mechanical anatomy of the tragedy. The Mark 18 torpedo was the Navy's great hope, a response to the German G-7E electric torpedo that had been terrorizing Allied shipping. It was quiet, it was smokeless, and on paper, it was the perfect weapon. But the transition from steam-powered Mark 14s to the electric Mark 18s was fraught with manufacturing hurdles. In the rush to outfit the fleet, the tolerances for the gyroscopic guidance systems were razor-thin. When Tube 24 was fired that night, the internal gyroscope, the brain of the weapon, likely suffered a catastrophic tumble. As the torpedo exited the tube, it didn't just deviate, it committed to a hard-over rudder position. On the bridge, the visual of the circular run was surreal. In the phosphorescence of the Pacific, the torpedo's path looked like a glowing finger of light drawing a death warrant on the surface of the sea. Commander Richard O'Kane, standing on the bridge, saw the curve and immediately understood. He shouted for emergency speed, a desperate attempt to outrun his own steel. But the Tang was a Belau-class submarine, nearly 312 feet of steel and heavy machinery. She could move, but she could not dodge. The torpedo traveled at 28 knots, completing its fatal circle in roughly 20 seconds. It struck the stern with a force that lifted the entire 2,000-ton vessel out of the water. The explosion in the aft torpedo room was so violent that it didn't just flood the compartment, it disintegrated the bulkhead. Those in the engine rooms had no time to scream. The seawater, pressurized by the depth, hammered into the ship like a solid piston, crushing everything in its path. For the men in the forward sections of the ship, the world suddenly tilted. The Tang began a steep, terrifying slide backward into the abyss. In the control room, men clung to valves and pipes as the deck reached a 40-degree angle. Every loose item, heavy wrenches, coffee mugs, codebooks, became a projectile. As the Tang slammed into the seabed at 180 feet, the silence that followed was more terrifying than the explosion. It was the silence of a tomb. Slowly, the survivors in the forward torpedo room began to find each other in the dark. They were trapped in a space roughly the size of a small living room, shared with the very weapons that had just sunk them. The air was already beginning to sour. The shattered batteries were leaking acid, which, when mixed with seawater, creates lethal chlorine gas. This gas is heavier than air. It crawled along the floor, forcing the men to stand on the torpedo tubes to breathe the remaining oxygen near the ceiling. The decision to attempt a Momsen lung escape was not made lightly. At that point in the war, the device had never been successfully used in a combat sinking at such depths. The lung was a primitive rebreather, a rubber bag filled with soda lime to absorb carbon dioxide. To use it, a sailor had to breathe through a mouthpiece, inhaling his own recycled air. If he panicked, if he breathed too fast, or if the soda lime became wet, the device would fail. But stay in the sub, and the chlorine gas or the rising water would claim them within the hour. Lieutenant Flanagan and the remaining senior officers began the process of equalizing. This is the part of the story that most people cannot fathom. To leave the submarine, they had to let the ocean in. They opened the flood valves, watching the freezing water rise up their legs. They had to wait until the air pressure inside the room matched the 80 psi of the water outside. The pressure change was agonizing. It felt like needles being driven into their eardrums. Men's noses began to bleed. The air became so dense it was hard to move their limbs, like trying to swim through syrup. One of the most incredible, yet tragic, aspects of the escape was the whistling rule. As the men left the escape trunk and began their 180-foot ascent, they were under strict orders to exhale continuously. If they held their breath for even a few seconds during the rise, the air in their lungs would expand as the external pressure dropped, tearing through their lung tissue and sending air bubbles into their bloodstream. This is the air embolism, a quick and violent death. To ensure they were exhaling, many of the men whistled or hummed tunes into the water as they floated toward the surface, a haunting, bubbling melody in the dark Pacific. Out of the 13 who made it out of the hull, only a handful reached the surface alive. Some succumbed to the pressure, others simply vanished in the blackness between the seabed and the air. When the survivors finally broke the surface, they found a hell's cape. The water was covered in a thick layer of diesel fuel that burned their eyes and lungs. They were miles from land, in the middle of a war zone, drifting in the dark. They clung to pieces of debris, watching the sun rise, hoping for a rescue that would likely never come from their own side. The rescue, when it arrived, was a bitter irony. A Japanese frigate, the very target the Tang had been hunting, spotted the survivors. The Japanese sailors were not in a merciful mood. They had just watched their comrades die in the explosions caused by the Tang's earlier hits. As O'Kane and his men were pulled onto the deck, they were beaten with clubs and rifle butts. One survivor later recalled that the beatings were so severe he almost wished he had stayed at the bottom with the ship. The survivors were taken to Ofuna, a secret interrogation camp operated by the Japanese Navy. Because the Tang was a high-profile ace sub, the Japanese believed these men held the keys to American naval strategy. For months, they were kept in special information status, meaning the Red Cross didn't know they existed. They were unlisted, unofficial, and completely at the mercy of their captors. They lived in 6 by 9-foot cells, forbidden to speak to one another, surviving on a bowl of thin rice water a day. Commander O'Kane lost nearly 60 pounds in captivity, but his spirit remained ironclad. He spent his days mentally reconstructing the Tang's patrols, memorizing every detail so he could report the failure of the Mark 18 if he ever made it home. The legacy of the USS Tang is one of the most significant chapters in the history of the silent service. When the war ended and the survivors were liberated, their testimony led to a total overhaul of torpedo testing protocols. The deadly mistake of the Tang ensured that no other American crew would ever have to fear their own weapon in the same way. The Navy realized that in the rush for technological superiority, they had bypassed the rigorous testing required for such a volatile machine. For the modern viewer, the story of the Tang is a reminder of the mystery that still lies at the bottom of our oceans. It wasn't an enemy's brilliance that defeated the greatest submarine of the war, it was a microscopic flaw in a gear, a stiffened piece of rubber, or a momentary glitch in a gyroscope. It highlights the terrifying reality of submarine warfare. You are always just one mechanical failure away from the abyss. When we look back at the records, the Tang remains the top-scoring U.S. submarine by many metrics, having sunk 33 ships totaling 116,454 tons in just 5 patrols. It is a record of unmatched lethality. Yet, her most famous kill will always be herself. The ship sits today as a war grave, a silent, pressurized time capsule of 1944. The men who remain inside, the 78 who didn't make it to the escape trunk, are honored every year at submarine veterans reunions. They are the men of the Eternal Patrol, serving as a permanent guard in the Formosa Strait. This story wins because it touches on the deepest human fears, being trapped, being betrayed by our own tools, and the impossible will to survive against the crushing weight of the world. The USS Tang wasn't just a ship, she was a testament to the fact that even the most elite warriors are ultimately at the mercy of the machines they command. As the sun sets over the Pacific today, the shadow of the Tang still lingers, a ghost that finally caught its own tail, leaving us with a story of tragedy, irony, and the incredible, whistling ascent of the few who refused to stay down.